To understand the Day of the Dead, we must journey into the past. We must journey into the minds, the hearts, the souls, and most importantly, the beliefs of the Mexica, the Nahuatl-speaking indigenous people of the Valley of Mexico, who were the rulers of the Aztec Empire. And to begin that journey, I will quote an ancient Mexica verse that translates into English as follows. Sometimes the hummingbird, sometimes the raven, sometimes the owl tells us when it's time to go. But we, the Mexica, do not die. We simply move to a different house, to a different body. And every year we come here. And where is here, you may ask? Here is home. Every year, all throughout Mexico, we celebrate the temporary return of the souls of our loved ones on Day of the Dead. It is a syncretic celebration that merges pre-Hispanic cosmology with the Catholic faith brought to America by the conquistadors. And given the pluricultural nature of Mexico, Day of the Dead has resulted in a diverse variety of cultural expressions that have been passed on from generation to generation, each iteration incorporating new rituals and meanings according to each particular community. In Mexica cosmology, Day of the Dead implies the transitory returns of the souls of our loved ones who come home to the world of the living to get together with us and to enjoy the essence of foods and other items placed in altars to commemorate them. In other words, we assemble altars with images of our loved ones, their favorite foods, treasured objects, even their clothes, to help their souls find their way home. As I mentioned earlier, the celebration of Day of the Dead predates the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors. Upon their arrival, the Mexica had no choice but to incorporate the practice of venerating their dead and merging it with the Christian calendar. The Mexica celebration used to take place between the last days of October and the first days of November, which happened to coincide with the end of the harvesting cycle of corn, which was then and still is now the main source of food in our country. If nowadays we celebrate Day of the Dead in November 1st and 2nd, it is simply because of the Catholic faith. The Catholic faith celebrates All Saints' Day on November 1st, and in Mexico, this date is dedicated to the Muertos Chiquitos, or dead children, whereas the Catholic faith celebrates All Souls' Day on November 2nd, and in Mexico, this day is dedicated to dead adults. In some parts of our country, October 28 is a date to commemorate those that died in an accident or tragically, and October 30 is a date to commemorate the limbitos, or little limbos, or children that died without having been baptized. Common threads in the indigenous celebration of Day of the Dead include the adornment of graves at local cemeteries and altars at home, as families think this helps guide the souls through a safe path after their death. And to facilitate their return to earth, we spread paths made with cempasúchil flowers, the bright orange color associated by the Mexica with the sun. As mentioned earlier, there are candles and other offerings interspersed with artisanal objects such as skulls made of sugar or papel picado or cut paper. It is also believed that the more effort and attention to detail we place to these altars and preparations, the more our loved ones' souls can bring prosperity to our lives as a sign of approval of our preparation rituals for their annual return. In celebrating Day of the Dead, we do not mourn the absence of a living person. Instead, we celebrate the living presence of its soul, materialized in the altar and its various offerings. Therefore, Day of the Dead is a joyful festivity of memory, of the soul of our loved ones who has returned to join us in celebration. Friends and visitors from other parts of the world may find our relationship with the calavera or skull rather unusual, perhaps even disturbing. To better appreciate this, it might be helpful to further unpack the Mexica cosmology, mythology, and death's place in their beliefs. And to do this, we must ask a basic question. Where do our souls go when we die? According to Mexica cosmology, when we die, we don't die per se. Instead, our souls begin to live again as we begin a journey to a place created by the gods called Mictlan, which translated to English means the place of the dead. This journey does not happen overnight, nor is it easy. In fact, according to ritual, it takes 4 years to get there, during which souls must endure a difficult journey to reach eternal rest. Why 4 years, you may ask? Some believe that this interval is equivalent to the approximate time it takes a body to decompose until nothing but bones remain, indicating that the soul has reached its destination. This is a modern depiction of Mictlan you are looking at, which actually has 9 different levels or areas and is inhabited by 2 deities, the Lord of Death Mictlantecuhtli and the goddess Mictlantzihuatl. These 2 gods were created by the founding gods Huitzilopochtli and Quetzalcoatl to oversee Mictlan and determine the final destination of those that die based on their cause of death. Parenthetically, it is worth remembering that the Mexica believed in human sacrifice as a way to honor their deities. Those that were chosen to be sacrificed were not only prisoners of war, but also could be slaves or other victims chosen specifically for specific celebrations. Whenever these sacrifices took place, victims were decapitated, their skulls were assembled in altars made of wood, and subsequently displayed for public exhibition. These altars were called tzompantli, and many such altars have been documented throughout Mexico. The word tzompantli comes from 2 Nahuatl roots, tzontli, which means skull, and pantli, which means row. As you can see from this illustration, the skulls were perforated on the sides and were displayed suspended next to one another. This particular illustration from the Ramirez Codex is associated with a very important finding that took place in the heart of Mexico City in the past decade at the archaeological site known as the Templo Mayor near the Zócalo. In August of 2015, Mexico's National Anthropology and History Institute announced what is considered the most groundbreaking discovery in recent decades, the site of the great Mexico Tenochtitlan Tzompantli. It was discovered along República de Guatemala Street, barely 2 meters underground, and the structure features mandibules and skull fragments, some of which date between 1873 and 1780 before the Common Era. When you take this into account, it should not seem strange when you read early chronicles by Hernán Cortés and Bernal Díaz del Castillo, who described such altars featured thousands and thousands of carefully arranged skulls as a horrible thing to witness. In conclusion, while our relationship with the human skull may seem gory to some and most definitely sacrilegious to the early Spanish conquistadors, it was yet another aspect of the complex cosmology of the Mexica and the everyday relationship we have with the human skull. But what about the Catrina? What about that ubiquitous skull that is not only the source of inspiration for our Day of the Dead makeup and can be found everywhere in figurines made out of porcelain and other materials? Is she a product of Mexica cosmology and tradition? Not at all. Think of the Catrina as a Day of the Dead archetype that is now so deeply intertwined with the celebration, it is difficult to imagine a time in which she was not. But where did she come from? When and why? Let us start with a proper introduction. Her full name is both Calavera Catrina and Catrina Garbancera. She was created in 1910 by celebrated cartoonist and lithographer José Guadalupe Posada. She wears an elegant hat adorned with flowers and ostrich feathers, but beyond that, she's a plain, ordinary skull just like all others. What was she supposed to represent? Posada created the Catrina Garbancera as a way to mock indigenous people that used to sell garbanzo beans. They were poor, perhaps even hungry to the bones, and yet they pretended to be wealthy, going as far as underappreciating their humble origins or customs. At a time in which photography was not yet developed for use in newspapers or newsletters, Posada worked creating illustrations on a daily basis for Mexico City's newsletters at the time. As such, the beloved Catrina Garbancera made her debut in a flyer, which was a common way to spread the daily news throughout the city. Posada described her as thin to the bones, but with a fancy French hat with ostrich feathers. If you pay close attention, the copy of the flyer includes short rhyming poems, which eventually came to be known as calaveritas, short poems that poke fun at newsworthy people and incidents of the time. The top copy reads, "Las que hoy son empolvadas garbanceras pararán en deformes calaveras," which roughly translates into, "Those dusty garbanzo sales ladies will end up as deformed skulls just like everybody else." The success of the Catrina and the many versions of it, not to mention the many verses created by Posada and subsequently other commentators of the period, never looked back. The Catrina went on to influence a huge variety of other artists, most noticeably Diego Rivera. Dream of a Sunday Afternoon at Alameda Central Park is a 15.6 meter wide mural created by Diego Rivera between the years 1946 and 1947 and is the principal work of the Museo Mural Diego Rivera in the historic center of Mexico City. It was originally created for the Versailles restaurant at the Del Prado Hotel across the street. However, the hotel was rendered uninhabitable after the 1985 Mexico City earthquake and condemned for demolition. So the mural was restored and moved to its present location. As you can see, the mural depicts famous people and events in the history of Mexico as they pass through the Alameda Central Park in Mexico City. But if you look closely, you'll see that the center of the mural is dominated by the elegantly dressed Calavera Catrina, holding arms with José Guadalupe Posada on the left, and to her right, she holds hands with a child version of Diego Rivera wearing short pants. Directly behind Diego stands his wife Frida. And of course, Catrina is wearing a feathered serpent boa around her shoulders as a nod to the Aztec culture. In short, the symbology of this beautiful painting as it depicts the bourgeois complacency and values from the time right before the Mexican Revolution of 1910 is as fascinating as its social commentary. Today we are barely scratching the surface on Mexico's popular Day of the Dead celebration. We are not diving into the complex world of Mictlan, the Mexica place for the dead, and its intricate levels and structure. We are not diving into the traditional elements that are commonly included in a Day of the Dead altar, including why different levels in the altar represent different things. We are also not diving in the marriage of convenience that takes place between Halloween and Day of the Dead in places like Puerto Vallarta, where both occasions are heavily celebrated, but to such a point that we begin to wonder, when does one end and the other one begins? And best of all, how can we, as English-speaking locals, join in the celebration? To answer these questions, I offer 3 general pathways for you to consider. Witness the celebration respectfully. As you have hopefully realized, Day of the Dead is a joyful, time-honored celebration, and as such, it should be handled with respect. This is particularly the case in places such as cemeteries. It is a very personal time for families, and it should never be used as a photo op or otherwise interrupted. Observing from a distance is always a much better option. You can also join the celebration enthusiastically. Several people have expressed concerns about offending Mexican nationals by taking part of Day of the Dead celebrations or parades. The good news is that there is no application form that you must fill out in order to embrace the cosmology of the Mexicas. We all have our own ways to honor our departed, so celebrating your departed by joining a Day of the Dead celebration is more than acceptable. It is absolutely encouraged. That said, you can also choose to celebrate Day of the Dead mindfully. Day of the Dead skull makeup, for example, has absolutely nothing to do with the United States blackface. In fact, not to make a gross assumption, but your average Mexican person out there will probably not even make the connection with the racial ramification of blackface. And if any Americans out there make that connection and chastise you, they will simply be manifesting their utter ignorance about the origins and traditions of Mexico's Day of the Dead. So if you choose to have your face painted and that's it, you should be all set to join the celebration. But you can also choose to be mindful about Day of the Dead by celebrating with intention. For example, you can honor a loved one or someone you admire in your actions. And no, I'm not suggesting a Halloween costume. I, for example, loved my mother very much, and I hang on to small Christmas ornaments she made out of felt. And one of them will probably be in one of my pockets as I'm out and about November 1st and 2nd, just to help her soul find me. Honor your favorite deceased singer, actor, or composer by enjoying their work during those days. Once you have taken the time to appreciate its origin and evolution, Day of the Dead is a joyful open canvas for all of us to paint on and for all of us to celebrate.